Oh, Dayton's paying attention then.
Yeah.
Wait,
Right.
30 minutes.
It's because I'm on my way to a new destination in my game, so I gotta wait like 20 minutes. I'm even there.
At least he's honest about it.
Yeah, he's
I'm
not
just kidding,
kidding.
Miss Hook. I'm always paying attention.
Okay, you were on an honest track and then you screwed it.
All right, so we were in the middle of examining the banking balance sheet, and a bank is concerned about its leverage ratio, the ratio of its assets to its capital. So the leverage ratio here, if you do the math, is a ratio of 20. Is that a healthy ratio? For every $20 the bank has in assets, $1 is from its owners, and the rest is financed with borrowed money. That is a terrible leverage ratio.
Yeah, actually, it's driving me nuts. I'm just gonna-
They're not my pictures, man.
Yep.
I will be sure.
No,
It's
the
fine.
sharp
It's
is
not
fine, but
covering-
all covered
It's
is the
not
number
covering
of the slide.
19.
It doesn't
Okay.
cover dollar sign.
So when you have a low leverage ratio, your profits and your losses are magnified tremendously. Okay? If the bank assets went from 1,000 to 1,050, up by 5%, the profits double. That's awesome. But if they go down, the bank now owns nothing. You want to maintain a pretty healthy leverage ratio. Okay? That bank just went broke when profits went down by 5%.
Wow.
No.
Sad trombone sound. Yep. Okay. So, to avoid the instance where banks get themselves into a poor leverage ratio situation, we have what is called a capital requirement. Okay. Banks have to have a minimum amount of capital, meaning they're going to be able to pay off the people that they owe money to. That would be their depositors. We're going to try something with chapter 30, since you guys have a whole, 9 days to read it, actually 10 days to read it and get some notes taken. I'm not going to pause for stuff like this, where it's exactly like this in the book and you should have already read it and written it down. We're just going to roll through all the definition stuff on the slides. So, encourage you to get through chapter 30, take those notes so that we can progress faster in class. All right, so in that financial downturn of 2008-2009, where the housing market collapsed, it was a problem for banks because they didn't have quite enough leverage. Okay, lots of banks failed, became insolvent. It was ugly. If you look here, the fact that 27 banks failed in 7 whole years, and then in 1 year, 166, that tells you how bad it was. Okay? The banks had gambled, and they gambled badly. When banks get very conservative and they stop lending out the money that they receive in deposits, we call that a credit crunch, meaning you who need to borrow on credit are unable to do so because the banks are going, you don't want to let go of any of it, I'm afraid. That can be very, very bad. Be very bad. We talked earlier about how General Electric was concerned about being able to meet their payroll. I'm not saying it again for you.
Wow. I didn't hear it.
I have a funny Snapchat scene.
Okay.
All right. So what we did is the government put a whole bunch of money into the system. They bailed out a bunch of banks, and part of the deal was, hey bank, I'm gonna give you this chunk of money, you have to turn around and lend some of it out. Most of the banks did as they were told, some of them did some of what they were told, and some of them went, my precious, and held all of the money that they'd gotten from the government and refused to lend any of it out. So the government's actions eased the credit crunch, but didn't eliminate it entirely. What are you smirking about?
That's just my face. I smirk a lot.
That bailout made us, as taxpayers, partial owners of these banks. They've been paid back, we've been paid back, at a profit, by the way. The taxpayers benefited from that exchange, though not as much as private investors did. All right. So, to refresh your recollection, the money supply is equal to the money multiplier times bank reserves. And the reserve requirement is set by the Federal Reserve. So we're going to talk about ways in which the Federal Reserve changes the money supply and why they might do so. They can do a couple of things. They can change the money multiplier, or they can change the reserve requirement. I was thinking a couple of days ago, trying to come up with a situation in which they've ever changed both at the same time, and I couldn't come up with one. I did not actually sit and Google it, but I couldn't come up with a time where they'd done both of them at the same time. Thank you. All right. So the Fed, through open market operations, can change the money supply by buying and selling bonds. By buying and selling bonds. So before I just give you the answer, let's see if you can figure out the answer. I have some government bonds here. There's some government bonds here for sale. They're $1 a piece. Who would like to buy a government bond? All right. I sell a bond and I take $1. And I sell a bond and I take $1. I sell a bond and I take $1. What have I done to the I'm sorry. I sell a bond and I take $1. What have I done to the money supply? I am the Fed, and I just sold bonds and took dollars. What have I done to the money supply? I decreased it. I took money out of the pockets of the public and replaced it with bonds. So by selling bonds, I decrease the money supply. I am the Federal Reserve, and I would like to buy your bonds. I'll give you $1.50 for every bond you have. Who would like to sell their bonds?
I would love to. Now that sounds good.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. What have I just done to the money supply?
Increase.
There we go. You two, I'm just taking your bonds. You don't know how to capitalize them with profit.
I was waiting for it like to double.
Yeah, exactly. Rookies.
Yeah, but you can't count your
Okay.
chickens before they hatch.
How much was my bond worth?
$1. You only made 50
What was the
cents.
inflation rate in between the sales?
Dude, that was 50% profit.
Yeah, that was still profit.
Yeah, I
It's
want
crazy
more.
profit.
I wanna know profit. What was the inflation rate?
Seriously.
7%.
So,
Then we're good. Yeah.
43%. Yeah, you were winners. Totally. All right. Very astute question to ask. All right. So, the Fed buys bonds to increase the money supply. They sell bonds to decrease the money supply. So think about that transaction, and you'll always be able to come up with what they should do. Now, read that and think. I, the Fed, sold bonds to you, the individual, and decreased the money supply. I bought bonds from you, the individual, and increased the money supply. If I, the Fed, do that same thing with the bank, the net result is no different. If I buy bonds from the banks, I'm still increasing the money supply, but I'm also doing so with the assistance of the money multiplier. Because by by buying those bonds from the banks, the money I give them goes in to their reserves, and they're able to then loan that money out. So I increase the money supply by multitudes when I conduct my open market operations with banks. Got it? Leverage. Okay. Do the opposite, and you suck money out of the money supply. So now, okay, I know that I can increase the money supply and decrease the money supply. Why would I want to? Under what circumstances would I want to decrease the money supply? When do I want to put a big baster into the circular flow and suck money out of it?
Giant beer.
No, not when there's leakage.
Like a giant
Decrease
turkey.
inflation by then.
If inflation is going up too fast, I need to take some money out of your pockets, people, because you're too willing to spend it. You're willing to compete with one another in the open market and drive those prices up. There must be too much money in your pockets. I need to take some money out. Likewise, if we have stagflation or deflation, or our inflation is too low and price levels aren't rising steadily, then we got a problem, and I need to put some money into that circular flow, speed things up a little bit. Okay? So you need to know why to do it, not just how to do it. The Fed can also loan money to banks. They do so at a deeply discounted interest rate called the discount rate. Convenient. Nobody but a bank gets the discount rate from the Fed, and usually that is an overnight loan. When a bank has made some loans, and then some depositors come in and take too much money out, and they're like, uh-oh, they're doing their books at the end of the day, and they're like, we're $2,500 short on meeting our reserve requirement. You call the Fed says, okay, you got it. The next morning, they hope they take in some more deposits, they pay the Fed back off. You only have to meet the reserve requirement at the close of business. Okay? Got it? And as a banker, if you're interested in making money, which you should be because that's why you got into banking, you want to be as close as you can to that margin. Okay? Now, in the day and age of electronics and electronic money transfers, we don't do the discount rate as often. The Fed says, all right, well, today we have $750,000 to loan out. And the banks who need money compete against each other in an eBay-style online auction where they bid up the interest rate for that loan. So the banks that most need the money are going to pay a higher interest rate to get it. Because what happens as a bank if you close your books for the day and you haven't met your reserve requirement? You get fined. So, the further you are from your reserve requirement, the larger the fine. So the larger the fine you're going to pay, perhaps the higher interest rate you'd be willing to pay to borrow money from the Fed to cover that so that you don't have to pay the fine. As long as the interest charge that you're going to pay is less than the fine, you should be willing to do it.
If it's not, would you just pay the fines?
Yeah, if you're a tiny little bank, well, you'd go to this term auction, right? You'd go to this and you'd try to get that money if you can get it for less than your fine is going to be. But if it once it gets past there, you're like, all right, whatever, I'm good.
Do you know how much the fine will be?
I'm sure there's a table that's published that tells them. I'm not
How often does like that actually happen?
all the time.
All the time.
All the time, very regularly. It's an expected and accepted way of doing business. The more conservative the banker, probably the less often it happens, but sooner or later, it's gonna work out that way. Okay. Now, here's the other thing. Maybe I've met my reserve requirement, I got no problem. But I also know that I'm not gonna bring in as much this month as I would like. I can still go to this term auction and see if I can get some nice cheap money at a real nice low interest rate, turn around, loan it out at a pretty decent interest rate to the consumer, right? And then I'm making money on the money that I borrowed.
It's just so weird how money is like,
It's a commodity
It's all about
in this instance.
it's like you're buying money.
Making more money so you can buy more later.
It is the living epitome of that axiom that I know you've heard before. It takes money.
To make money.
This is the living, breathing evidence of it. Okay, so when it comes to the reserve ratio, the reserve ratio is indirectly related, or inversely, not indirectly, inversely related to the money multiplier, right? So if I raise the reserve ratio, what am I doing to the money multiplier? Decreasing it. If I decrease the reserve ratio, I am increasing the money multiplier. Good. The Fed sets that reserve requirement. This is a new thing. To encourage banks to hold a little bit of excess reserve, or to meet their reserve requirement quite regularly, banks have a bank, and that bank for bankers is the Federal Reserve. So a bank can deposit its reserve requirement with the Fed, and now they're getting a little bit of interest on it. That serves the Fed as well, because for the Fed, that's part of the Fed's reserves, that they can turn around and loan out in that term auction facility, right? Got it? If the Fed raises that interest rate, they might incentivize bankers to put more than their reserve requirement in the Fed, thus pulling money out of the money supply. Got it? So we've got a lot of means through which the Fed can manipulate the money supply. All of this is monetary policy. We will get to fiscal policy, which Congress controls. All right. There are problems with the Fed's plan to control the money supply. You as a consumer, you ever heard the phrase consumer confidence? Now that I've been making you read the news, some of you should have heard it once in a while. Okay? Consumer confidence. If consumers are not very confident about the state of the economy, they tend to spend less. They tend to hold more. They're going to keep it in their demand deposits, or they're going to hold it in currency. And that makes it difficult for the Fed to alter the money supply. If you've got stacks of Benjamins sitting in the safe behind Great Aunt Gertrude's portrait in the library, how many? None of you have a portrait of Great Aunt Gertrude in your library. You have safe behind it, right?
We don't have a library.
Yeah.
What's a library?
Yeah. All right.
I have a safe behind a picture though.
So the more money you're just holding because you're a little freaked out about things. It happened before the year 2000. Have you ever heard anybody talk about the Y2K? And everybody was convinced that the lack of the 4-digit numbers in the computer coding was going to crash everything and none of us would be able to access anything, so people started hoarding cash. We had real problems with the money supply at that point. There was another one fairly more recently. Yeah, 2012, the Mayan calendar, and it was going to be the end of the world. Yeah. Spoiler,
That's
it
when-
wasn't.
That's when mine was.
Okay.
It was just the start,
Yeah, I was
guys.
really
It's a
brave.
long process to end the world.
Wow.
It started then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Do Do you mean we've already begun the end?
Yeah,
Oh,
I think we begin end.
Didn't we begin the
We didn't
end when
begin
started
before
the
that.
beginning?
I have news for you. I'm dying.
No.
We began
So
the
are all
end
of
when
you.
the world
What?
began.
I don't know about that.
Hannah, you know how the end began
Very
when
skeptical.
the beginning began?
You know the beginning
Alright.
ended with the end.
The beginning begins with a B. Alright,
Oh.
So is another word.
The beginning began with the T.
well, the beginning begins with a T.
Nice.
Railroad crossing, look out for the cars. Can you spell that without any R's?
No.
T-H-A-T.
T-H-A-T.
That.
Wow. Good
What
one.
do you call a fish with no eyes?
Push.
Yeah.
Alright, so if banks do the same thing and they hold more than the minimum reserve requirement, the money supply is gonna fall. The Fed can do some things to compensate for what individuals and banks do. They can exaggerate their actions in the open market to do that. Does the Fed adjust the reserve requirement very much? The answer is no. Most of what the Fed does is through open market operations and the interest rate. Okay. We've talked about bank runs, right?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Now, what we have is our fractional reserve banking system. It can't, a fractional reserve system can't survive a bank run. If all of the depositors showed up and tried to pull their money out of the bank is in bad shape because they only have X percentage of all of those deposits on hand. It's the way that it is. But it's better than where they held zero reserves and they had almost none of the deposits on hand. Being able to say to people, I can give you 5% of your account, come back tomorrow, I'll get you more, is far more reassuring than, yep, whoops. Great word, Scott. Yeah, whoops is not what you want to hear from your banker when you go in to withdraw your life savings. Whoopsie is even worse, I think. Okay. In a situation where it looks like there's going to be a bank run or consumer confidence is declining, we watch as banks stop loaning out and making loans so much. How does a bank just stop loaning out money? Well, they can raise the income requirements on applications. They can raise the interest rates by making the money more expensive. It makes you as a consumer less likely to borrow that money. Right? Higher price is a great disincentive. For instance, how many of you have a Lamborghini? Yeah, see, high price, great disincentive, you're a liar. Unless it's a Matchbox Lamborghini, then I'll buy that. Yes, Dave?
So if you have money in a bank and then the bank, like everybody does a bank run and then the bank fails, how is your money?
Well, we have the FDIC now, since
So
the
you
Great
get your money.
Depression. As long as your deposits have not exceeded the FDIC amount, $200, $250. As long as your deposits are only $249,999.99, you're great.
So you just keep
If you
them
got $3
separated?
million in that bank, you're gonna be crying.
Is that why we talked about
So you
like
always
different
separate,
banks with
if
money?
you have more than 250, you separate it?
As far as you can. At a certain point, that becomes impractical. Warren Buffett's not wasting his time doing that.
That's why you just hide it in the basement.
So, because you have multiple,
Then you're decreasing the money supply and hurting the economy.
multiple accounts in the bank, like where
No,
you, or is it?
multiple accounts, no, it's per depositor.
Okay.
Per depositor. So yeah, having 5 $50,000 accounts and watching the interest roll into those does not make you safe. Did you have a question, Delaney? Alright. So we've talked about the depression and the money supply issues and the bank runs. So that is why we have the FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation. The UK has a similar system. They have their central bank. They have reserve requirements. And they have a bank that went through a bank run, a bad one, in 2007. And the central bank just took it over. And our Fed can do that as well. They can go down and shut down a bank where they think that there's malfeasance. There's constantly inspections going on. All right, the federal funds rate. When you are short on your excess reserves, you can borrow overnight at the federal funds rate. It's a little higher than the discount rate to penalize you for possible failure to anticipate. Okay? The Fed Open Market Committee uses open market operations to target the federal funds rate. So they'll take whatever that rate has been that they've been auctioning the money at, and they'll say, okay, well, that's kind of the going rate for folks who knew they were going to need money. Now you, at 4:59 and 45 seconds, who just showed up at the Fed going, you're going to pay a little higher rate than the guy who knew at 3 o'clock that he was going to be short and borrowing some.
Jeez, they're
Yay.
excited.
That is, open market operations are exciting. Let's hear it.
Wow.
Let's hear it. Woo! Oh, come on, open market operations! There you go. All right.
Open market.
Yeah. All right.
Dead weight loss.
Now, when the Fed funds rate changes, that can impact other interest rates because many other interest rates are calibrated to the federal funds rate. For instance, if you are a bad consumer and start leaving balances on your credit cards that you aren't paying off monthly, the interest rate that the credit card will charge you is tied to this federal funds rate. And that's the one that they will change to raise interest rates to combat inflation. That's what we're seeing them do recently. So there's our federal funds rate. Look at that in the 80s. Owie, owie, owie. So the prime rate follows the federal funds rate. It used to be very closely, and it's spread now. And in there is the margin where the credit cards are making all of their money. Okay? Credit cards will often say the prime rate plus X percentage. They're charging you even more than that. Okay? A 3-month T-bill. T stands for
Tension.
Treasury. 3-month Treasury bill. That's the bonds that the Fed is selling in their open market operations. Okay? They're selling those bonds. Okay? Okay. Graph time. Now remember, R is the interest rate, but R sub F is the federal funds rate. Capital F is federal funds. So we still have price and quantity. We're just specifying what the price is and what the quantity is here. Because we have these labels, should we give them a boo this time?
Yeah. You gotta count it though.
1, 2, 3.
Boo! It's like we're cows.
Didn't hear the beginning of it.
Oh.
We don't necessarily even have to put a title on it because we'll be able to tell what we're graphing by those labels. All right, how would you describe that demand curve?
Unit. Close.
Maybe a little
A
inelastic.
little inelastic, more inelastic than unit elastic. Okay.
Oh. Wow.
Okay. So if we have a federal funds rate of 3.5%, then we have this many federal funds. So they want to raise this number, so they're going to sell bonds in the open market. That decreases the money supply. We have a new federal funds rate and a new amount of federal funds. So exactly like all the other supply and demand graphs you've drawn, just with a new understanding of what these are representing and how we're achieving them. So the goal is increase the price. The only thing we can affect is supply as the Fed. We can't change consumer demand for money, but we can change the supply of money. So we figure out we gotta sell bonds to decrease the supply of money to raise the federal funds rate. Textbook AP question. What action should the Fed take? What will the impact on the market be? How does the Fed?
God dang it. We're not working this year. Why don't you just go walk over there?
You should take the
Just bang on the wall.
like 6 hours.
Everybody just bang on the wall.
When she was coming because Hannah was laughing so hard. Just take your yardstick and go in there.
Yeah. I don't like to remember this.
I agree.
We're just gonna go hit him?
First good.
I like
Now
this
we're just
idea.
gonna freak them out by giving them the silent treatment.
That's lame.
See if they hit us
That's
again.
honestly
If
super
Oh.
they
lame.
hit us again, we'll come up with something.
Hit him with the 110.
Hit with 210.
Hit him with 310.
Do you remember when Kai's like hiding in the desk so it's so scared because there's the
Shouldn't understand. You don't understand, do you?
No, it makes sense.
I think that was more accurate than you would have been.
Okay, thanks a lot. You good
If
there,
they
bro?
hit us again, we'll all kick the metal fronts of the desks. That makes a terrible racket.
You should do it just now.
No.
I
No,
feel
right
like
now.
tennis makes terrible rackets too.
What a dab.
Should we
Yeah,
sacrifice?
such a wind up.
Yeah.
Alright, oh my God.
Sacrifice.
That was an Alabadabs.
Oh, what?
Elaborate that.
Hey,
Alright,
Whoa there, whoa.
hey there.
Chill.
so, quick review.
That's so smart.
The 3 functions of money you're gonna need to know. You're gonna need to know the 2 types of money. So there's functions of money, there's types of money. What kind of money do we have?
Money.
What kind of banking system do we have?
I go back one.
Okay,
Go
so
back
these
one.
are literally the same bullet points that are at the end of the chapter before the end of chapter questions. Literally the same bullet points.
Let's see. No, because there's a lot of bullet points.
Wow.
Are you going through all of them?
Yeah.
She's not done
Oh,
yet.
okay.
Wow.
I should know
Central
there
Bank
more.
of the U.S. Nice. Boom.
How many bullet
I
points
beat
you
the
have?
picture to the punch.
You beat the
She
picture?
tried to change it, but I got the picture.
Wow.
You beat the picture.
I wasn't trying to beat you.
Here in my book, I'm